Greetings, this is Greg. It's time to talk about the Wright Brothers and the invention of the airplane. In the last year or so, I've seen 3 videos, all from large established channels, saying that someone else built the first heavier-than-air successfully flown airplane, and all 3 are dead wrong. This is not some form of nationalistic pride on my part. As you'll see in this video, I'll give the French and some others a lot of credit for their contributions, but I'll be making the case that the Wrights were the first to build and fly a heavier-than-air airplane. As I have quite a bit of ground to cover here to prove my point, this may turn out to be a long video. To keep things simple from this point on, every time I say airplanes or aircraft, I'm excluding balloons and blimps and the like. This video is about heavier-than-air types. When watching the videos claiming that the Wrights were not the first, I immediately see a couple problems in their logic. They're generally playing very loose and fast with definitions of words. Words like aircraft, airplane, or flight, or being a little unclear about their claims and saying things through implication. That will not help dodge my counter-arguments. The definition of flight as it applies to airplanes is pretty important here. With a loose enough definition, one could argue that man has been flying since the beginning of time. I'm sure at some point an Icarus wannabe made some wings and jumped out of a tree and descended at a slightly reduced rate before hitting the ground. Would that qualify as flight? What about a soccer ball or football if you prefer? They certainly fly through the air when kicked or thrown, but if you put a person inside of a giant ball and kicked it through the air, would that then qualify as a heavier-than-air manned airplane? Certainly not. You can find examples of these types of flights as far back as you want. There are records of man-lifting kites dating back about 1,500 years. I don't think there's any question that these existed. Even if we go back thousands of years, we can find examples from Sumeria that may be representing early attempts at Icarus-like flight. Now, some channels will tell you these are aliens or gods. You can decide what you think is more likely. My point is that if you play loose enough with the definition of flight, you can always argue that someone else was first. We need to use the term flight as it applies to aircraft as we know them today. So, what does it take for an aircraft to achieve flight? First of all, an aircraft has to be controllable. Furthermore, it has to have enough control authority to counteract the inevitable minor gusts of wind, updrafts, and downdrafts it will encounter. Now, I'm not saying it has to be able to fly in severe weather, but it does have to be controllable enough so that its safe return to Earth is not largely a matter of luck. To this day, nobody has built a successful airplane that carries a person into the air for more than a few seconds, yet isn't controllable, and I think the reason for that is self-evident. We'll be talking a lot about controllability. It's a key issue here, and one that a lot of the pre-Wright Brothers aircraft, let's call them that, did not have. Next, in the case of a powered aircraft, it has to be able to sustain speed and altitude beyond what the launching mechanism provided. In other words, if your catapult can throw an object the weight of your airplane 500 feet, and your first flight is 500 feet, I think we can say that the design work you put into your plane did nothing. Ideally, a powered plane should be able to sustain speed and altitude until it exhausts its fuel supply, and then a little bit more because it could glide. There are cases of early aircraft that were not controllable, had engines with propellers, and were sometimes launched by catapult. None of the examples prior to the Wright brothers actually flew, and for a few years after the Wright brothers, nobody did anything more than what I'll call a powered leap. That's to say that they were launched, went a few feet up, a bit forward, and then reconnected with the ground or water, and I'll be getting to some examples of this later. Let's move on to the Wright brothers. There seems to be a misconception that they were just 2 guys who built upon the work of others and sort of lucked into getting credit for inventing the airplane. And that there were numerous successful flights at various places around the world at about the same time, and the Wrights just happened to get credit for being the first. Not only is that wrong, it's dead wrong. Of all the serious efforts to invent the airplane, all were on the wrong track in at least one or two major areas. And as for getting the credit, there were actually strong forces allied against the Wrights, which we'll talk about. In fact, the U.S. government tried to prevent the Wrights from getting credit. The Wright brothers, Wilbur and Orville, were not highly educated, but they were highly intelligent. They were from a middle-class family in Ohio and were both ice hockey players, and at least somewhat athletic, which will be a factor in their work. They had various jobs, owned a successful bicycle shop. They were good at fixing things and building things. Before they built the airplane, they built a highly sophisticated printing press. At some point, they decided to try and build an airplane. They put a lot of thought into this, and they started the project as you or I probably would have. They began by gathering all the information they could from the others that tried this before they did. I'm going to hugely summarize their efforts for the sake of brevity. My source for this information, or sources, are the journal entries they made and the mountain of letters they wrote to their sister as they worked on this for a number of years. They quickly decided that any attempt to duplicate the flapping of a bird's wings was doomed to failure. They studied birds, as had others, but their deep understanding of mechanical things led them to conclude correctly that the flapping motion of a bird's wings was beyond anything they could duplicate. Therefore, they only focused on birds when they were gliding and looked elsewhere for propulsion. This left them with four major problems, and these are the four problems that were affecting anyone trying to invent the airplane. Of these problems, no other inventor prior to the Wrights fully solved even one, let alone all four. Not Lilienthal, not Octave Chanute, not Alexander Graham Bell, certainly not Samuel Langley, not anyone. Here are the four problems. 1. How do we generate enough lift to carry the weight of the craft and the pilot? 2. How can we control the craft? 3. How can we propel the craft? 4, and the last, most overlooked and maybe most important factor, how can we learn to fly the craft without killing ourselves? This last one is a biggie. If you could somehow today send a Cessna 150 back in time to 1901, let's say, with all the pilot manuals you could shove into it and full tanks of fuel, it's highly unlikely anyone from that time would be able to successfully fly it. The Wrights understood from their experience with bicycles that just because you know how to do something doesn't mean you have the needed skill set to pull it off. Let's start with lift. The Wrights felt, and I agree, that the most successful aviator up to that point was a German named Otto Lilienthal. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Lilienthal built gliders which flew off the side of a hill. He controlled his gliders by shifting his weight around. The drawback to this method is that the larger your glider, the less effective your control, but the glider has to be large enough to have wings big enough to lift you. With the materials he had at the time, he either didn't have enough lift or not enough control, usually the latter. His flights were sort of a glider's version of the powered leaps I mentioned earlier. He didn't have a catapult. Instead, he flew downhill. Thus, the distance traveled had more to do with the slope of the hill than the actual aerodynamic properties of the glider. In other words, a glider that falls 1 foot forward or travels 1 foot forward for every 1 foot it falls would have a 1-to-1 glide ratio, which would be pretty terrible. Now, on a 45-degree slope, it could glide forever, or until it ran out of slope to follow. Now, Lilienthal's glide ratio is better than that, but my point is that his distances traveled are largely due to the slope effect and not actual gliding. They also ensured that he was never very far off the ground, so when his lack of controllability failed him, he usually survived. At this point, I should mention that the hill used by Lilienthal was man-made specifically for this purpose. Thus, the slope was ideal, and he was always able to go downhill and with a headwind. Of course, the inevitable did happen. One day when he was gliding down the hill, a gust of wind sent him up to a higher altitude, almost 50 feet above the earth, and his control method was insufficient to deal with the upset, and he crashed to his death. Lilienthal documented a lot of what he did, and his tables of lift were initially used by the Wright brothers to calculate various factors of wing design. The Lilienthal tables of lift were sort of a world standard at the time, and the Wrights used them as a guide, at least initially. Among the various people designing airplanes prior to the Wrights' first flight, there was not a consensus on how things should be done. Some people thought that wing profiles should not be curved and insisted that they should be flat. The Wrights took all this information in and found that no matter what they did, no matter whose information they used, they could not get enough lift to do much of anything. They built their own wind tunnel, did their own experiments, and learned correctly so that Lilienthal's tables of lift were off by a huge margin. This may have been one of their most important realizations, because at this point the Wright brothers agreed to throw out all the information that had come before them and only focus on what they themselves could prove to be correct. I'll summarize the solution to the lift problem by saying that with their wind tunnel and experiments, the Wrights figured out that the wings have to be curved in profile in order to generate the amount of lift they were going to need. Now, I'm sure at this point, one of my viewers is saying, well, a flat wing can work with the right engine and enough power you could do it. After all, you can make a radio control stop sign fly. Yeah, that's true. However, in order to generate the lift needed within the speeds they would be able to reach, there is no way a flat wing would have worked. Many of the other efforts going on at the time were still using flat wings, which was a total dead end. And even today, no full-scale airplane is set up that way, not one that carries people. They also figured out the correct proportions needed and the construction method, so the wing would generate enough lift and have enough strength to do the job. In short, the Wrights figured out everything needed to design and build a working wing, and thus solved the first problem, that of how to generate enough lift. But next, we have the issue of control, and this was by far the biggest problem for the Wrights and everyone else. Nobody had a method of control effective enough to work on an aircraft large enough to carry the needed weight. Consider this. The materials and building skills to create a glider had been around at least 1,000 years. That's important because some people make the argument that the Wrights really didn't invent anything. It was just natural evolution of technology and they were sort of in the right place at the right time. That's not true. The Romans certainly had enough woodworking and fabric skills to create a glider. The reason they never did, and the reason nobody ever did prior to the Wrights, not an effective one, that could operate, more than a few feet off the ground for more than a few seconds, is because nobody ever figured out a decent method of control. It's very clear when reading through the Wrights' letters that they really struggled with the control issue. Pitch was pretty easy. They fully realized that they needed an elevator. This is the first area where they got a bit lucky. They got lucky a few times, they got unlucky a few times, but in either case, when they were unlucky, they persevered and powered through it. But the luck I'm speaking of in this case is their decision to locate the elevator forward of the pilot, which is opposite of a bird. You see, their thinking, which isn't incorrect, was that a forward elevator would be right in front of the pilot, thus easily visible. They felt that would make it easier to learn to fly, since they could see the elevator move and respond to their control inputs. Yeah, that's true, but there was another factor here they didn't realize, and without it, I'm not sure they would have survived their whole testing process. At this point in development, they did not understand wing stalls. Nobody did. Now, with a rear-mounted tail, when the wing stalls, the plane usually goes nose down. With a forward elevator or canard type, like the Wrights were using, during a wing stall, the wing tends to pancake down. Since the Wrights operated their craft in the prone position, stalls at low altitude, of which they had a lot of while learning to fly, resulted in a soft impact onto the sand in a direction their bodies could take a pretty good hit, kind of like absorbing a really hard check in ice hockey. Had they been going in head first every time, I don't think they would have ended well. Roll control was a critical aspect of the design and one that nobody else had figured out. The idea of twisting the wings for roll control came from birds and, of course, was verified in their own testing. Yaw control was a bit of a mystery for them. The two brothers had huge all-nighter arguments about this, often still arguing by morning and finding that they had each switched to the other's initial position and were now arguing for the other side. I'm really summarizing here to burn through all this because there's so much material when you're talking about the Wrights inventing the airplane. But At first they thought, as most did, that a vertical tail wasn't needed at all. They thought that, later they thought that a vertical stabilizer was needed, but that it didn't have to move. Of course, we have the advantage of knowing what they had to figure out, but the problem was that whenever they tried to turn, the glider they were flying would yaw the wrong way and not respond correctly. The problem was that any time you bank using wing warping and ailerons, and yes, the Wrights understood ailerons, they went with wing warping because it was an easier way to solve certain problems, lighter, less mechanism, that sort of thing. But in any case, the wing with the downward warp, or the downward moving aileron, will generate more drag and pull or yaw the airplane opposite of the turn. Eventually, the Wrights figured this out, and they put in a single movable rudder to counteract what we now call adverse yaw. That term, of course, didn't exist at the time. This is just one more thing on the long list of factors that nobody else ever figured out prior to the Wrights, and it's a factor that is essential for controlled flight. So, now we have lift and controllability, but how did they teach themselves to fly without killing themselves? Well, they contacted the National Weather Service, or whatever government agency performed that function. I actually don't know the name of it, but the objective was to find some place that would always be windy. And that place turned out to be Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, specifically Kill Devil Hill. They moved all their gear down there, and they set up shop in 1899 and began their glider testing. This is where they did the bulk of their work and development. The reason they wanted the wind is because their plan to learn to fly involved tethering their gliders to the ground and flying them as both unmanned and manned kites. This was brilliant, as it allowed them to get the feel of the controls for a considerable period of time while staying very close to the ground. When they would crash due to a stall, design problems, or just plain pilot error, they would just pancake down a few feet due to the previously mentioned canard design, and when they did, they landed on the relatively soft sand dunes. Soon, they had a fully flyable glider with adequate lift, controls, and the skills to fly it. Adding an engine and propeller was the next step. Now, you might think that part would be easy, but no. There was no engine made that would do the job. The Wrights, along with a bicycle shop mechanic that worked for them, his name's Charlie Taylor, made their own engine. And I mean they made it themselves. They cast the block. The block was aluminum, very unusual at the time. So the timing of their first flight had nothing to do with a new engine coming onto the market. That was all them. They saved the propeller for last. They'd talked about it and assumed they could just put it off. They figured that props were common in marine use, so they would just get marine data, adjust it for compressibility of air, and make a propeller. It was at this point they learned that there was actually very little written science on propellers. It was largely all trial and error or word of mouth among designers. Not entirely, but largely. So they had to learn about propellers, and they did. They correctly figured out that the blades have to have the right amount of twist in them to maximize power. This is because the prop is moving slowly at the center and needs a greater angle of attack at that point than it does at the fast-moving tips. They also decided to use twin counter-rotating propellers to avoid asymmetrical thrust problems. At this point, it all came together, and it was time for the first powered flight. Before we get to that, let's have a quickie review. At this point, the Wrights had solved all of the key issues. They figured out the correct formulas for lift, which nobody before them had managed to do. And obviously that's essential to claim that you invented the airplane, or invented flight, or whatever. They created a control system that worked. Again, nobody had done that. They figured out a way to learn to fly safely. Now, I'll argue that nobody else had really done that, but I understand that you could make a case for Lilienthal's hill method. After all, he did survive a lot of steep, uncontrolled glides, about 2,000 of them, averaging about 9 seconds in length. But ultimately, that lack of control killed him. So that leaves power. Others had engines, but if you look at their propellers, they didn't look anything like propellers from airplanes that flew later. The Wright propellers look quite similar to propellers from later aircraft. I want to say just a couple more things about Lilienthal. He did consider making a powered aircraft, but his ideas centered around wing flapping, which would have never worked. In my view, his primary contribution here was in inspiring the Wright brothers, and although his tables of lift were not even close to correct, it was that discovery that set the Wrights down the correct path. Lilienthal was certainly a brave individual, and his dying words are inscribed on his tombstone: "Sacrifices must be made." I think that's the most fitting and in a way the most German thing he could have said at that moment. Now, the Wrights spent most of 1903 building the powered Wright Flyer. Its first successful flights were on December 17th of that year. Both brothers flew that day, making a total of 4 successful flights, the final flight lasting 59 seconds. Now, that doesn't sound like a long time, but if you put yourself in the frame of mind of someone in 1903, at a time in which nobody had ever successfully flown a heavier-than-air aircraft, and look at your stopwatch. 59 seconds is a long time. The Flyer was going into a 27-mile-per-hour headwind, and thus only traveled 852 feet off the ground, but the distance through the air was much greater. That's important because sometimes people state very short distances, forgetting that it was a 40-mile-an-hour airplane flying into a 27-mile-per-hour headwind. It's the distance through the air that really matters in this case. Now, after the 4th flight, while moving the airplane on the ground, a powerful gust of wind picked it up, flipped it over, and severely damaged it. But it didn't matter too much. At this point, the Wrights were set to build a new airplane and use what they'd learned, and they were going to move their operation back to Ohio, which they did. However, there was something that affected their flight that day. They certainly didn't know it, not yet, and it would be years before they or anyone else figured it out. In fact, even today, few people really understand this. The air pressure at Kill Devil Hill at the time of their first flight was unusually high, and it was unusually cold. These two factors combined to give the plane more performance than it would have had under normal conditions at sea level. In terms of the standard atmosphere, the Wright Flyer was about 2,000 feet below sea level, giving its engine extra power and allowing the wings to make extra lift at an unusually low airspeed. The Wrights had designed and built a plane that would fly, but just barely, and they caught a break that day, but they didn't know it, and that would soon cause them a problem. We'll get to that soon enough. And I'm not saying that they got lucky and that they flew. I'm just saying that they probably would have flown several days later or something had the weather not been so favorable to them on that day. Now, at some point during the development of the plane in Kitty Hawk, the Wrights started taking the commercial possibilities of aircraft seriously. In fact, you can pinpoint that exact date in their letters. They understood that to actually profit from their invention, they would have to patent it. But what exactly do you patent? You can't patent the concept of an airplane. Let's remember that the Wrights spent their own time and money on this, and a lot of it. The plane cost about $1,000 to build, and that was a lot back then for middle-class people. They focused on patenting the control system, which was probably the right strategy. However, in order to prevent others from stealing their design and getting papers shuffled around at the U.S. Patent Office so that thus somebody else could claim the patent first, they had become very secretive about how everything worked. This secrecy and the fact that there were very few witnesses to the Wrights' early flight created some skepticism, actually a lot of it. Many people didn't think the Wrights could fly and speculated that the photos of them were doctored. It didn't help that on May 23rd of 1904, a large number of reporters went to watch the Wrights fly in Ohio, and the Wrights couldn't get off the ground. They didn't know it yet, but a contributing problem was density altitude. Summers in Ohio put them at a density altitude of about 3,000 feet. The original Wright Flyer flew at negative 2,000 feet. That 5,000-foot difference was a lot to overcome. It's been suggested by some modern writers that the Wrights were faking their inability to fly, their inability on that day to throw the copycats off their trail. I don't think that's true. It's my opinion that they fully intended to fly that day, but the density altitude and mechanical problems worked against them. Now, just a few days later, a smaller number of reporters witnessed some very short flights, but with so few of them present and with such anticlimactic weak performances, nobody really noticed, Again, it was the density-altitude issue, which was hurting them a lot in the summer of 1904. Of course, they did succeed. Their design did work, and by August of 1904, they were back in the air, and by November, they had made flights up to 5 miles long and could fly in circles. They made a lot more progress in 1905 and 1906, but at this point, not a lot of people believed them. Almost no one was really paying attention. The local press in Ohio knew that they could fly, and quite a few locals had seen them fly, and there were films and pictures and everything else, but on the world stage, most people thought they were frauds. Worse, since most people involved in aviation had now seen pictures of the Wright flyers and had actually probably seen some movies of them flying, they could surmise certain design features. For example, from a photograph, you can see that the Wrights were using wings with a curved profile, and you can deduce the approximate size and shape. Thus, by copying those features, you can duplicate the lift characteristics. Observers could also see and understand the elevator's function. However, it's nearly impossible to see the way the roll and yaw controls work. Even being a pilot and standing next to a real Wright flyer, it's hard to see that. Thus, at this point, numerous aviation pioneers started to come onto the scene. However, none really flew. At this point, they're all stuck in the powered leap phase, while the Wrights are actually able to fly. The U.S. government didn't have any interest in the Wright flyer. They did want an airplane, and had invested $50,000 in Professor Samuel Langley's failed attempts. And well, that's a story for another time. For now, just know that the Wrights did try and sell a plane to the U.S. first. But for what I consider to be political reasons, they couldn't get any traction. And like I said, that's a whole other story. So, they decided to try and sell to the French. Now, the French have a long and very glorious history in aviation. At this point, specifically with hot air balloons, but after the Wrights, they had a lot of advancements in heavier-than-air aircraft also. So, in 1907, Orville Wright packed up their latest flyer and shipped it to France. The overall opinion in France at this point was that the Wrights were fakes. In fact, that was the opinion in almost all of Europe and a lot of the United States as well. So the Wrights figured that Wilbur should fly in France right in front of the French aviation community and put an end to these ugly rumors. However, when Wilbur arrived in France, he found that his airplane had been badly damaged by French customs. They unpacked the plane and then repacked it carelessly, and of course airplanes are very delicate. Wilbur had to rebuild it in order to make it airworthy again, and that was a big job. Thankfully, a Frenchman by the name of Leon Boully, who was a balloonist and an auto manufacturer, so hey, he liked airplanes and automobiles, gave Wilbur a workshop and a team of mechanics to help him. Wilbur didn't speak French. The mechanics didn't speak English, so this was a daunting task, but they did rebuild the airplane. It took them about 6 weeks. Then there were delays for rain, but finally, on August 8th, 1908, after years of seeing European newspapers calling them frauds and worse, the Wrights finally had their chance to prove to the world that they could fly, and do it in front of the French aviation community. The Wright flyer was at a field near Le Mans, which was often used for flying. Keep in mind, all the flying they had ever seen in France at this point, in terms of heavier than air, was just these feeble-powered leaps we've discussed. Planes would lift off and usually go straight and set back down after a short distance. The French had they'd made a lot of progress in having powerful engines. So with powerful engines and more or less okay wing design, they could do that. And the really good airplanes in France at the time could take off, make an uncoordinated skidding turn of a few degrees, and then touch back down. But that was about it. This is 5 years after the Wrights' first powered flight, and 4 years after they'd been flying for miles at a time and making 360-degree turns. So that shows you just how far ahead the Wrights were, even though a lot of their secrets had leaked out by this point. So, Wilbur climbed into his plane. The engine roared to life. He took off and flew for 2 minutes, in which he did 2 figure eights, something nobody had ever seen before, at least nobody in France. Those in the grandstands understood what they were seeing. They realized this was something entirely different, not just a powered leap, but an aircraft that was under total control of the pilot. Now, not many were there, but it was a few dozen and that would be enough. Specifically, there were two boys there. They had snuck under the fence and they watched the whole thing. And after Wilbur landed, they got on their bicycles and rode back into the town of Le Mans, shouting, "He flies! He flies!" The next day, when Wilbur came out to fly again, he looked at the crowd, and this time the crowd numbered in the thousands. The French, with their long history and passion for aviation, understood what they were seeing, and they came out in droves to watch them. At this point, even the most aggressive critics of the Wrights had to concede that they were wrong, and they did that. There were all sorts of retractions published. The Wrights were so far ahead of the rest of the world, there was simply no comparing. Back in the U.S., newspapers had to take notice, and the Wrights finally got the credit that they deserved. Sadly, the Wrights then ended up in a patent battle. Some powerful factions wanted to essentially steal their invention and came up with various ways to try and get around the Wrights' patents. This is the reason you often see ailerons located in weird places on early U.S. aircraft. Eventually, the Wrights won the patent case because their patent did in fact cover ailerons regardless of type and location, and that's extremely clear. So yes, the Wrights did invent the airplane. They solved the problems of lift, control, learning to fly, and propulsion. Not only that, they were still far ahead of the rest of the world in 1908. Now, it seems that at some point, every YouTube content creator finds the need to respond to another YouTube channel, and there are several ways to do this. One is to hide behind the camera, not mention any names, and just try and attack the other person's viewpoint. That's just not my style. I can't criticize someone else's work anonymously when they've been brave enough to express their thoughts in front of the camera. So here we go. I think the views expressed by History Guy, Lindybeige, and Real Engineering on this subject are all incorrect. All three have either said or at least strongly implied that someone else invented the airplane, someone other than the Wright brothers. They all make a case for somebody different. And I plan to counter each argument. First, History Guy. In the unlikely event you see this video, I want to say I love your channel. I think your videos are first rate. I think the world needs more people like you teaching history. In fact, I watch your videos with my grandkids to teach them about history. That's how highly I think of your channel. In regards to your video about Richard Pierce, I disagree with your statement that, and I quote, "He may well have been the first man to fly an airplane driven by an engine," unquote. I also disagree with the implication of the entire video that the Wrights may not have been the first to fly a powered airplane. It's a good video otherwise, though, full of interesting stuff. Pierce himself says that his first experimental airplane never flew, and there isn't any solid evidence that he ever flew, period, let alone prior to the Wrights. All we know, based on eyewitness reports, is that he crashed. Crashing is not a prerequisite, or correction, I should say, flying is not a prerequisite for crashing. You can do that with forward speed alone, and the fact that some people saw him crash into a hedge, that's not really all that meaningful. Now, I don't want to do this with picture-in-picture, so let's go back to full-screen images. Take a look at the wings here. They're flat and of relatively narrow span. To make matters worse, they have bamboo underneath exposed, disrupting the airflow. I don't think these are going to generate any significant amount of lift, probably not any lift at all, and certainly not enough to fly at the speeds the aircraft could reach. As for what some are calling ailerons on this thing, they're unlike any ailerons on any airplane that ever actually flew. I'm not sure it's accurate to call them ailerons. The outer panels in the middle of the wings open up, much like the flapper of a dryer exhaust in your laundry room. When the flapper moves, it makes a big hole in the wing, which is going to destroy what little lift these wings might have. Of course, I can't say I know what Pierce was thinking, but I don't think his intent here was to bank the airplane for purposes of turning, like you do with ailerons. I think these were intended to help keep the wings level, if it ever got off the ground, which I don't think it did. On to his propeller. Yes, the variable pitch is impressive. I have no doubt Pierce was a clever guy, and his efforts are really impressive, especially as you pointed out, because he was working in a very isolated situation. However, there's no way that that propeller, and I'm barely comfortable calling it that, could have generated any decent amount of thrust. That's probably why no plane ever flew with propellers that looked anything like that. In short, I like the video, I'm glad you made it, and it is history that deserves to be remembered, and that is kind of the theme of your channel. Richard Pierce's efforts were massively impressive. I just disagree with the implication that he was first in flight. And when he was alive, Richard Pierce himself agreed with me. Moving on, this one isn't a YouTube channel issue. Some are still making the claim, though, that Samuel Langley's aircraft was the first one capable of powered flight, or the first to fly. This is absolutely false. On December 7th, 1903, just 10 days before the Wrights' famous first flight, Samuel Langley's aircraft, named the Aerodrome, was launched from a catapult and did not fly. It plunged directly into the Potomac River. His team rebuilt it and tried again the next day, A for effort. This time it broke up on the catapult during launch, and the pieces of it went directly into the Potomac River. That should be the end of the story, but sadly it isn't. In 1914, Glenn Curtiss, who had been one of the primary characters trying to essentially steal the Wrights' invention, teamed up with the Smithsonian. Both had a vested interest in showing that the Wrights didn't invent the airplane. Curtiss, because he was trying to avoid paying the Wrights for the use of their patent, and the Smithsonian because they had egg on their face from the failure of the aerodrome. Keep in mind, this was prior to FDR's New Deal. This was at a time when the government taking the citizens' money by force and giving it to a chosen group to work on their pet project was generally frowned upon. Then, when that pet project failed epically, and subsequently 2 non-college educated brothers with no government backing succeed with minimal funding, well, it doesn't look too good for the government-backed guys. So, Glenn Curtiss and his team rebuilt the aerodrome. However, this was in 1914. It's the start of World War I. The secrets of flight are now pretty well known. That cat is totally out of the bag. So, using knowledge that the Curtiss team had, they made dozens of modifications to the aerodrome, and with that team of experts, they managed to fly it. Sort of. It never rose more than 3 feet above the surface and never stayed in the air for more than about 5 seconds. However, that was enough for the Smithsonian. They then proudly claim that the aerodrome would have been the first plane to fly had it not been for a catapult failure, and declared that it was the first airplane capable of powered flight, and displayed it as such in their museum. Fast forward several decades, and once most of those involved in this were dead, the Smithsonian came clean about the modifications to the aerodrome and retracted their false claims. At that point, the Wright Flyer took its rightful place in the Smithsonian where it rests today. Still, there are some who argue that the aerodrome was the first. It wasn't. In fact, it never really flew. It only managed at best about a 3-foot-high, 5-second-long powered leap in 1914. On to Lindybeige. This channel is awesome. It's one of my favorites. Lloyd, it's his channel, covers a very wide range of topics. It can make things that would ordinarily sound pretty dull just fascinating. In fact, I'm looking forward to watching some of his videos later today when I ride on Lufthansa to Frankfurt. They really help pass the time. And they're also pretty long, which is unusual among YouTube content creators. Rather than try to summarize Lloyd's point, I'll just put up this clip. Hopefully he doesn't mind, but I just don't want to risk misquoting him. Obviously, all the credit for this clip goes to the Lindybeige channel, all those kind of disclaimers. Now, he doesn't flat out say that the Wrights didn't invent the airplane, but when you see the clip, I think you'll see that the implication is very clear. So here's the clip.
Lord Northcliffe. Lord Northcliffe was the owner of the British newspaper The Daily Mail, and he himself had in 1903 watched at Kitty Hawk the Wright brothers make what some people say is the first ever heavier than air powered flight. It's sort of not. In a number of ways. There were British flights, for instance, using steam engines that were a long time before that, and I've heard tell of many other people using heavier than air craft, but it seems that the Wright brothers were the first people to get filmed doing it, and see above, that really helps. But whether they were the first or not is not that pertinent, perhaps just the leap in technology.
Now, sometimes we're all a little bit biased. I certainly fall into that trap on occasion. Lloyd is British, so from his perspective, the Lancaster is the best bomber of World War II. Some variant of the Churchill tank was the most effective weapon. The British soldiers are the best jungle fighters, and the Spitfire saved the civilized world. I get it. Go team. However, he's dead wrong here. There is so much more evidence than just the fact that the Wrights filmed the flight. There were witnesses, pictures, more importantly, maybe most importantly, a high level of detailed information on just how they did it that stood the test of time. Not to mention the fact that they did it over and over. Their work wasn't a result of a leap in technology. As I pointed out earlier, the technology to build a glider just like their 1902 model has been around for centuries. Let's look at the two examples he put up. I'll put up the second one first since it's the stronger case. These are two of John Stringfellow's models. Yes, they are models. The picture on the left is the one Lloyd showed in the video. You can tell it's a model by the scale of the background objects. Plus, it's known historically. It had about a 10-foot wingspan. You've heard about this particular model before, at least many of you have. In the movie Flight of the Phoenix from 1965, a character references the fact that model airplanes were flying well before the Wright brothers ever got off the ground. This is the model that character was referencing. I couldn't find the scene and to get the exact quote. It was actually a very powerful scene and a good scene in the movie, and I'm quite certain that I'm right about this. Now, let's move past the fact that this is a model and not a real airplane, which is obviously a huge difference. People have been building things that look like airplanes and hurling through the sky forever. And let's get to the discussion of whether it flew or not. It was powered by a little steam engine, and it traveled along a guide wire. At some point, the wire ended, and the model continued forward for some distance. That's not flight as it applies to aircraft. It's just an object in motion remaining in motion until something interferes with it. The model had a 10-foot wingspan and flew indoors to eliminate the tiny air currents that would upset it, and it traveled anywhere from about 10 feet to about 90 feet. In other words, a distance equivalent to 1 to maybe 9 times its wingspan. It had no inherent stability, so it relies on being totally isolated from external forces in order to stay upright and maintain forward travel. You could not scale this thing up and fly it. It doesn't have control surfaces. It has a flat wing, hopeless propellers. In short, its alleged flights had much more in common with a thrown ball than with an airplane. Now, let's move to the other picture Lloyd showed. Normally, Lloyd is a very skeptical individual, at least in terms of what things he seems to accept as evidence on his channel. But he seems to have put away his skeptical nature for a moment because even a quick glance shows that this thing is pure fantasy. What we're looking at here is the Henson Ariel steam carriage. It is not a real thing, not even close. Henson joined forces with Stringfellow, the model guy we talked about a moment ago. They incorporated the Ariel Transit Company with the purpose of raising money to build the steam carriage. The picture, along with the models I just talked about, were part of an effort to raise money. I don't think I need to tell anyone how this ended, but there's a reason nobody ever got that ride on the Ariel steam carriage. Now, Lloyd, in the unlikely event that you see this video, let me just say that I don't think you really believe that either of these two invented the airplane. But if you do, please contact me. I have a bridge in Muskogee I'm selling. Love to talk to you about it. On to the last channel I'll mention. It's Real Engineering. There's a video on that channel titled Wright Brothers Didn't Invent Flight, or something very close to that. Of course, the term flight is a bit nebulous, but the implication is clear. The video never really says who invented flight, but seems to give the nod to Lilienthal. Lilienthal was, and still is, considered a big deal. The highest award in the gliding world is a medal named after him. Again, we're back to the definition of flight. If what Lilienthal did can be defined as flying, then he certainly wasn't the first. People have been strapping wings and running into the wind far back in recorded history. Again, remember the man kites in Asia. His average flight was simply a 9-second fall into the wind down the side of a man-made hill he built for that purpose. While he was an important historical figure, very influential to the Wrights, certainly very brave, there's just no way you can define what he was doing as flying as it applies to modern aircraft. His lift calculations were off by a massive amount. As I pointed out, the Wrights actually lost a lot of time following Lilienthal's incorrect data. His wings had no hope of generating enough lift to truly fly, and that alone should end any claims that he was the first to fly or invented heavier than air or anything. He had no control system that had any hope of working on anything large enough to be practical. Now, decades later, with light and strong materials, we saw the development of some small recreational flying machines like hang gliders that are controlled with weight shifting. However, these use a setup that's very different from Lilienthal's, and in any case, still doesn't work well enough to be used on a practical aircraft. Lilienthal's thoughts on powered flight revolved around flapping the wings, so we need to just skip that and move on. He did have a reasonable way of learning to fly without killing himself. As I pointed out, I think the idea of running into the wind down a man-made slope was a pretty good one. I can't prove this, but I think that gave the Wrights the idea of tethering and going to a really windy place. If you think that all through, that's kind of the logical conclusion. So, at best, Lilienthal solved maybe one of the problems of flight, which is learning how to do it. However, to claim he invented flight as it applies to airplanes, no, you have to have solved all four problems, or at least three for a glider, and at best he solved one. That's all for now, so have a great day. Oh, and one more thing. In that last video, and I know not a lot of you saw it, but it's the one that has the Mercury capsule simulator, the Combat Information Center. We somehow get into Battlestar Galactica. Anyway, regarding the mystery engine, good job to Central of the channel I Fly Central for correctly surmising that it is a diesel. That turns out to be correct. Apparently the museum figured out what type of engine it is, and one of our viewers here went there, got the details, so I put those in the description on that video. Turns out it's a 5-cylinder radial liquid-cooled diesel. Why anyone would build a liquid-cooled radial, I'm not sure. There must be a story there, and I'll probably put out more information on that when I have it. So, anyway, that's it. I'll leave you with a film of Billy Parker's airplane I took just a few days ago. Bye-bye.